It was a cool Saturday morning in the small town of Willow Creek, a peaceful place where everyone knew each other by name. The community center sat right in the heart of town, a big old building where most events happened. Every year, people from the town gathered there for the annual talent show. It wasn't a grand competition with fancy lights or cameras, but it was special to everyone. It was the one night when ordinary people, children, teenagers, and even adults got to show their hidden skills. Among the crowd that year was an elderly woman named Margaret Thompson. She lived alone in a small cottage near the park. Most people in the town knew her as Grandma Maggie, the kind lady who always smiled and gave candies to kids. She was gentle, polite, and quiet. Hardly anyone knew much about her life, except that she had lost her husband years ago and spent her days tending to her garden, reading and visiting the local library. One group of young adults, known for their teasing humor, thought it would be funny to play a little joke at the talent show. They often made jokes to make people laugh, sometimes too far, but never with bad intentions, at least not in their eyes. This time, they decided to secretly write down Margaret's name on the list of participants. "Let's put Grandma Maggie's name down for singing," one of them said with a smirk. "It'll be funny when they call her name." They all laughed, thinking it would just be harmless fun. The day after, a volunteer from the community center knocked on Margaret's door with a cheerful smile. "Mrs. Thompson," the young woman said, "we're so excited to see your name on the list for this year's talent show. We can't wait to hear you sing." Margaret looked puzzled. "Sing?" she repeated, tilting her head. "Oh dear, there must be a mistake. I didn't sign up," but when she saw the enthusiasm in the volunteer's eyes, she hesitated. "Well," she said softly, "maybe it's been a long time since I've sung, but perhaps I could try." When the volunteer left, Margaret stood by her window for a long time, thinking. She hadn't performed in front of anyone for almost 50 years. But somewhere deep inside her heart, something stirred, a tiny spark from her younger days. When Margaret was young, she loved singing more than anything. Back in the 1960s, she had even joined a small local choir and dreamed of becoming a professional singer. She would practice for hours in her bedroom mirror, pretending to sing on a big stage. Her voice was her pride, soft yet strong, full of emotion. But life had taken her in another direction. She married early, had children, and worked hard to support her family. Slowly, her dreams faded into the background. Like an old song she had forgotten the words to. Now, as she stood in her quiet house, surrounded by framed photos of her children and memories long past, she smiled softly. "Maybe it's time I sing again," she whispered to herself. News spread quickly around the town. "Did you hear?" People said, "Grandma Maggie is performing at the talent show." Some laughed, thinking it was just a silly joke. Others were curious. A few even felt sorry for her, expecting she'd be embarrassed on stage. The young group who had put her name down snickered when they heard she actually agreed to perform. "No way," one of them said. "She's really going to do it. This is going to be hilarious." But Margaret didn't know about their laughter, and even if she had, she wouldn't have cared. Every evening that week, she practiced quietly in her living room. She took out an old tape recorder, one she hadn't used in years, and pressed play. Out came the soft, crackling sound of her favorite song, the same one she used to sing as a teenager. Her voice trembled at first, weak and unsure. But the more she sang, the more confidence returned. Her eyes lit up, her back straightened, and her voice began to flow with surprising strength. It was as if the years melted away and the young woman she once was came alive again. By the end of the week, she felt ready. She picked a simple blue dress from her wardrobe, the one her late husband had always loved, and smiled at her reflection. "You've still got it, Maggie," she said softly. The night of the talent show finally arrived. The community center was packed, buzzing with excitement. Children laughed, People chatted, and the smell of popcorn filled the air. Margaret sat quietly in the back row, waiting for her turn. Some people greeted her kindly, while others exchanged amused glances. But Margaret stayed calm, her hands folded neatly in her lap. When her name was called, a few people chuckled under their breath. The same young adults who had written her name on the list grinned at each other. "Here we go." One whispered. Margaret stood up slowly and walked toward the stage. The lights were bright and the room fell silent. She could hear her own heartbeat as she took the microphone. She looked at the audience, faces young and old. Some smiling, some skeptical. And instead of fear, she felt peace. For the first time in decades. She was exactly where she belonged, standing before people, ready to sing her heart out. What began as someone's little joke was about to become something unforgettable. The night after she agreed to sing. Margaret Thompson sat in her cozy little living room, wrapped in a soft blanket. The clock ticked quietly on the wall, and the only light came from a small lamp beside her chair. She stared at the old tape recorder on the table, the same one she had used when she was young. Dust covered its buttons, and the cassette inside hadn't been played in years. Her fingers trembled slightly as she pressed the play button. A soft crackle filled the air, followed by a gentle tune. It was her favorite old song, the one she used to sing when she was just a girl. The melody filled the room like a warm memory, carrying her far away from the present, back into a time when her world was full of dreams. Many years ago. Long before she became Grandma Maggie, she was simply Margaret Rivers. A bright young woman with golden brown hair, laughter in her voice, and a head full of songs. She grew up in a small countryside town where music was her escape. Her father was a factory worker, and her mother spent her days sewing clothes for neighbors. They didn't have much, but Margaret had a voice that could fill the fields with beauty. Every Sunday, she would sing in the church choir. People used to stop and listen when she sang. Even the pastor would pause for a moment, smiling proudly. One day, her mother used to say, "You'll sing on a real stage, my girl. You have a gift from heaven." Margaret dreamed of that. She dreamed of bright lights, microphones, and applause. She would close her eyes and imagine herself performing in front of thousands of people, her voice echoing across the hall. But life had its own plans. When Margaret turned 20, her father fell ill. The hospital bills were high, and her mother needed help. So, Margaret gave up her dream of joining a music academy and instead took a job at a small bakery in town. It wasn't easy, but she worked hard and never complained. Then she met William Thompson, a kind young man who came in every morning for coffee and a smile. He was gentle and funny, and soon they fell in love. They got married a year later and started a simple life together. Margaret sang sometimes at birthdays, at small gatherings, when rocking her children to sleep, but she never performed again. William always told her, "You still sing like an angel, Maggie." She would laugh and say, "That angel's retired now." When William passed away 10 years ago, the house grew quieter. The song stopped. She kept herself busy with gardening and volunteering. But deep down, she missed the feeling of singing that freedom. That light inside her chest when her voice filled the air. Now, as she sat listening to her old recording, tears welled up in her eyes. On the tape, she could hear her younger self, confident, full of life, fearless. "Oh, Maggie," she whispered, "you used to believe in yourself." She leaned back, closed her eyes, and let the music take her back in time. She saw herself at 19, standing in a white dress, singing under fairy lights at a local fair. The crowd had clapped and cheered. That was the last time she truly sang for others. She remembered how alive she had felt that night, her heart racing, her soul glowing. Something inside her shifted that night in the present. For the first time in years, she felt a small fire burning again. It wasn't about showing off or proving anyone wrong. It was about remembering who she used to be, the girl who loved music more than anything. The next morning, she walked to the park near her home. It was quiet except for the birds. She stood near the fountain, took a deep breath, and began to sing softly. Her voice was shaky at first, but then it grew stronger. A few people walking by stopped to listen. One little girl tugged at her mother's hand and whispered, "Mommy, she sings pretty." Margaret smiled. That moment felt like magic, as if life had given her a second chance. She realized something powerful. Dreams never truly die. They might sleep for a while, hidden under years of silence, but they never disappear. That evening, she pulled out an old box from under her bed. Inside were yellowed photos, faded letters, and newspaper cuttings, memories from her youth. At the bottom was a folded piece of paper with song lyrics written in her handwriting. It was a song she had written for herself long ago, one she had never sung publicly. The words read, "No matter how far I go, the song inside me will still grow. I'll sing again, though years have passed, my voice will rise, my dream will last." She pressed the paper to her heart and whispered, "Maybe it's time." That night, Margaret began practicing for the talent show. Her neighbors could hear her voice through the window, soft and graceful, like a forgotten melody returning home. She sang with emotion, with love, with memories of the past. The people who had once joked about her would never have imagined that behind her quiet smile was a lifetime of untold stories, a young girl with a dream, a woman who gave everything for her family, and now, an elderly lady who is ready to find herself again. Margaret was not just preparing for a performance. She was preparing to reclaim a part of her soul, the part she had hidden away for too long. And this time, she wasn't singing for applause. She was singing for herself. The big day had finally arrived. The air in Willow Creek was cool and crisp, with a gentle breeze that carried the smell of rain and fresh flowers. The streets were busier than usual that evening, families walking together, teenagers laughing, little kids jumping with excitement. The annual town talent show was the biggest event of the year, and everyone was heading to the community center. Inside, the hall was glowing with fairy lights and colorful banners. The wooden stage was small, but neatly decorated, with a shiny red curtain and a single microphone standing tall in the center. Volunteers were running around, checking sound systems, arranging chairs, and handing out programs. Laughter and chatter filled the room as people found their seats. Margaret Thompson arrived quietly, holding a small handbag and wearing a simple blue dress that shimmered under the light. It was the same dress she had worn to her anniversary dinner with her late husband years ago. She had even pinned a small white flower to her chest, the kind William used to pick for her from their garden. As she stepped inside, a few people turned to look. Some smiled kindly, but others whispered, "She's really going to sing." One woman murmured to her friend, "Bless her heart." The friend replied with a sympathetic tone. The group of young adults who had written her name on the sign-up sheet sat near the back, half grinning, half nervous. "I can't believe she actually came," one of them said under his breath. "This is going to be awkward." But Margaret didn't notice any of it. She took a deep breath, looked around the room, and smiled gently. For her, this wasn't a place of judgment. It was a place of memories. She could almost hear echoes of her younger self in the laughter and music. The show began with cheerful energy. Children danced to pop songs. A teenage boy played guitar, and a group of sisters performed a funny skit that made the crowd roar with laughter. The audience clapped and cheered, enjoying every act. Backstage, Margaret waited quietly on a wooden chair, hands folded on her lap. She could hear the audience from behind the curtain, the applause, the music, the voices. Her heart thumped softly in her chest. She wasn't nervous exactly, but there was a strange mix of excitement and peace inside her. A young volunteer peeked in and said, "Mrs. Thompson, you're next." Margaret nodded. "Thank you, dear." She stood up slowly, straightened her dress, and took a small sip of water. She whispered to herself, "For William. And for that girl I used to be." The host walked to the microphone and announced, "Our next performer is a special guest, Mrs. Margaret Thompson." The crowd clapped politely, though a few chuckles could be heard. Some people assumed it was just a light-hearted act to fill time. As Margaret stepped out from behind the curtain, the lights brightened. She walked slowly but gracefully toward the microphone. The room grew quiet. For a moment, the sound of her footsteps on the wooden floor was the only thing anyone could hear. She looked out at the crowd, rows of faces watching her curiously. She saw the group of young adults whispering at the back. She also saw children in the front row smiling at her, eyes wide with innocence. And somewhere in the middle, she noticed a woman about her age, nodding encouragingly. Margaret felt her heart swell with emotion. She wasn't there to prove anyone wrong. She was there to share something real, something that had been asleep in her heart for years. She reached for the microphone, her hands trembling slightly. For a second, she closed her eyes and took a deep breath. The spotlight felt warm on her face, and the silence in the hall seemed endless. Then, the music began, a soft piano melody that filled the room like a gentle breeze. Margaret opened her eyes and began to sing. Her voice started softly, almost like a whisper, fragile but full of soul. Within seconds, the crowd went still. The laughter stopped, the whispers faded, and every pair of eyes turned toward her. Her tone was pure and rich, carrying decades of emotion, joy, pain, love, and longing. As the song continued, her confidence grew. Her voice filled the room with warmth and power. People leaned forward, surprised. Even the young men who had once joked about her were frozen, their smiles fading as they realized what they were hearing. It was not just singing. It was storytelling, every word painted with the colors of her life. She sang about dreams that never died, love that never faded, and courage that never grew old. Tears began to glisten in the eyes of the audience. Parents held hands, children stopped fidgeting, and even the judges sat quietly, completely captivated. There was no laughter now, only a dot as she reached the final line of the song. Her voice rose like a wave, powerful, graceful, and full of emotion. It echoed through the hall, leaving a silence so deep that even the air seemed to pause. Then, as the music faded, Margaret slowly lowered the microphone and bowed her head. For a second, no one moved. The hall was utterly still, and then one clap, then another, then 100 more. In seconds, the entire crowd was on its feet, clapping, cheering, and shouting her name. Margaret looked up, stunned. The people who once doubted her were now applauding her with tears in their eyes. The young men who had laughed were now clapping the loudest dot for a brief moment. Time stopped. Margaret smiled, her eyes shining. She had done it not for fame, not for attention, but for herself. She had found her voice again as she walked off the stage. The applause followed her like a wave of love and respect. For the first time in many years, she didn't feel old. She felt alive, and deep inside her heart, she knew that her story, the one she had buried long ago, had finally been sung. The room was silent, the kind of silence that feels alive, waiting, breathing. The lights dimmed softly as the pianist prepared to play. Margaret stood at the center of the stage, her hands trembling slightly as she gripped the microphone. The warmth of the spotlight touched her face, and for a moment, she felt both exposed and alive. She could hear her own heartbeat echoing in her ears. The crowd sat still, unsure what to expect. A few people whispered softly, but their voices faded as the pianist struck the first gentle key. Margaret closed eyes, and then she sang. The very first note that left her lips was soft, fragile, and pure. It floated through the air like the sound of a memory returning home. It wasn't loud, but it carried something powerful emotion. The kind that made people stop whatever they were doing and simply listen. The audience, which moments ago had been filled with quiet amusement, fell completely silent. Even the young group at the back, who had put her name on the list, stopped grinning. Something about that first note, that trembling, heartfelt sound, silenced every smirk in the room. Margaret's voice grew stronger as she sang the second line. It was as if her soul had been waiting for this moment, and now that it had come, nothing could stop it. Her tone was rich with wisdom, with years of love, loss, and hope. Each note seemed to carry a story of her childhood dreams, her marriage, her laughter, her heartbreak. People could feel it. The hall wasn't just filled with music. It was filled with life. In the front row, a little girl leaned against her mother and whispered, "Mommy, she sounds like a fairy." The mother smiled, her eyes already glistening as the song continued. Margaret forgot the stage, the lights, the crowd. She was somewhere else entirely. She was 19 again, standing by her window on a summer night, singing her favorite song while the crickets hummed outside. She was back in her youth, where dreams were fresh and love was new. Her voice carried through the hall like a wave of emotion. The pianist, though he had never met her before, found himself moved to tears as he followed her rhythm. Her timing was perfect, her tone flawless, not because of practice, but because she sang from the heart. The lyrics she had chosen were simple. A song about finding one's voice again after being silent for too long. Every word felt personal, as if she was telling her own story through music. When she reached the chorus, her voice soared, clear, strong, and beautiful. The crowd collectively held its breath. It was no longer just an elderly woman singing. It was an artist reborn. A man in the third row whispered to his wife, "I had no idea she could sing like that." His wife nodded, eyes wide, unable to speak. Even the young men at the back, the ones who had signed her up as a joke, sat frozen in shame and admiration. One of them muttered softly, "We shouldn't have laughed. She's amazing." Margaret's heart pounded as she reached the bridge of the song. Her voice quivered with emotion, not from fear, but from truth. Every lyric she sang came from deep within her, a lifetime of memories. Joy and pain wrapped in melody. She wasn't performing anymore. She was living the song. The audience began to sway softly, lost in her voice. Some wiped tears from their eyes, others smiled without realizing it. Even the judges, who had been jotting down notes earlier, had stopped writing completely. They just listened as the music slowed near the end. Margaret took one deep breath. The final lines of the song were delicate, a whisper of hope and gratitude. "I thought my song was gone, but it lived inside all along. And tonight, I let it fly again to the stars where dreams belong." Her final note lingered in the air, trembling gently before fading into silence. No one moved. No one spoke. The hall was utterly still, as if afraid that even a breath might break the moment. Margaret slowly lowered the microphone. She looked out at the audience, a sea of faces, wide-eyed and emotional. For a brief second, she wondered if she had done something wrong. Why wasn't anyone clapping? Then, it happened. A single clap echoed from the back. Then another. And another. Within seconds, the entire hall erupted into thunderous applause. People stood to their feet, clapping, cheering, and wiping their tears. The sound was overwhelming, loud and full of love. Margaret covered her mouth in disbelief. Tears filled her eyes as she looked out at the crowd. The same people who once doubted her were now standing, cheering for her like she was a star. The young men at the back were clapping too, their faces red, their eyes soft with guilt and admiration. For a few seconds, she just stood there, soaking in the sound. The stage lights sparkled like stars, and her heart felt lighter than it had in years. She bowed slowly, smiling through her tears at that moment. Margaret wasn't just an elderly woman performing at a local talent show. She was the girl who had once dreamed, the woman who had once loved, and the singer who had finally found her voice again. The crowd's applause echoed long after she walked off the stage. People whispered to each other, "That was magic. She was incredible. How did we never know?" And deep inside, Margaret knew that single first note had changed everything. It had broken the silence of years, healed her heart, and reminded everyone in that room of something beautiful, that true talent never grows old. Asterisk. The sound of applause filled the room, echoing like thunder. For a moment, Margaret couldn't believe what was happening. Just a few minutes ago, she had walked onto the stage feeling unsure and nervous. Now, the entire audience was standing, cheering, clapping. Some even crying. The young men who had put her name on the list as a joke were the first to realize what they had done. Their laughter was gone, replaced by guilt and awe. They exchanged glances, realizing that what they thought would be funny had turned into one of the most powerful performances they had ever seen. Margaret stood there, with her hands clasped in front of her, tears forming in her eyes. She wasn't used to attention like this. All her life, she had been someone in the background, the quiet lady who baked cookies, the kind neighbor who smiled from her garden gate. But now, all those eyes were on her, not out of pity or politeness, but pure admiration. The host of the show, still half stunned, stepped forward with the microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his voice trembling with excitement. That was breathtaking. The crowd erupted again in cheers. Margaret smiled softly, still overwhelmed. Backstage, the performers who had been waiting for their turns looked at her with wide eyes. One of the young girls, barely 16, ran up to her, hugging her tightly. "You were amazing," she said. "I want to sing like you when I grow up." Margaret hugged her back, her heart swelling with warmth. "You already can, dear," she said gently. "You just have to sing what's inside your heart." As she walked off stage, the pianist followed her, tears still shining in his eyes. "Mrs. Thompson," he said quietly, "I've played for hundreds of singers, but I've never felt anything like that before." She smiled, touched by his words. "Thank you," she said softly. "That means more than you know." In the audience, people were still talking about her performance. "How old do you think she is?" one woman asked, wiping her eyes. 80, said her husband. "Doesn't matter. That voice is timeless." Even after the show continued, people couldn't stop whispering about her. Every performer who came after her seemed inspired, giving their best performance of the night. It was as if Margaret had changed the entire mood of the event, turned it from a casual town show into something magical, something meaningful. But the real turning point wasn't just in how the audience saw her. It was in how Margaret saw herself as she sat backstage. Listening to the next performer, she felt something she hadn't felt in decades: pride. Not the loud, boastful kind, but a quiet pride that filled her chest with warmth. For years, she had believed her best days were behind her, that her dreams had faded with age. But tonight proved her wrong. Her voice, her music, had never left her. It had been waiting patiently inside her heart, waiting for her to believe again. When the show ended, several people came to speak with her. Some wanted photos, others wanted to shake her hand. A local journalist who had been covering the event approached her with a wide smile. "Mrs. Thompson, may I ask how long you've been singing?" Margaret laughed softly. "All my life," she replied, "just not always out loud." The journalist grinned. "That's beautiful," he said. "Would you mind if I write about you in tomorrow's paper?" She blushed. "Oh, I don't know if I'm newsworthy," she said. "Trust me," he replied. "Everyone in this town will want to know your story." The next morning, Margaret woke up to the sound of her phone ringing. Her neighbor, Mrs. Harris, was on the other end, her voice full of excitement. "Maggie, you're in the newspaper. Front page. Margaret laughed in disbelief. Oh dear, what have they written now? She walked to the store that morning, and sure enough, there she was, her picture on the front page of the Willow Creek Gazette. The headline read, "Elderly woman brings entire crowd to tears with her soulful performance." Beneath it was a photo of her on stage, eyes closed, singing from her heart. The article told the story of how she was signed up as a joke, but turned it into a night the town would never forget. By the afternoon, the story had spread online. Someone had recorded her performance on their phone and uploaded it to social media. Within hours, it began to go viral. Comments flooded in from all over the world. "I cried watching this. This woman's voice is pure soul. Age doesn't define talent, she's living proof." Margaret's small town suddenly felt bigger. Reporters started calling. People sent letters. And even a TV producer reached out, asking if she would perform on a national show. But for Margaret, the biggest moment wasn't the fame or the applause. It was the realization that her dream had never truly died. It had simply been waiting for her to open her heart again. That night, as she sat by her window, sipping tea and looking out at the quiet street, she smiled softly. The same street she had walked for years, unnoticed. Ordinary now felt different, she whispered to herself. "I thought life was done, surprising me. But I was wrong." The laughter that once mocked her had turned into admiration. The joke had turned into a legend. And the woman who once doubted herself had become a living reminder that it's never too late to shine. The night was still young when Margaret stepped off the stage. But for her, it felt as if an entire lifetime had just unfolded in those few minutes. The applause behind her hadn't stopped. Even as she walked down the short hallway toward the backstage curtain, people were still clapping, still cheering her name, Margaret. Margaret. Her hands were trembling, not from fear anymore, but from overwhelming joy. She turned back one last time and saw the audience still on their feet, a sea of smiling faces, bright under the warm stage lights. Tears sparkled in her eyes as she took in that sight. It was the kind of moment that no words could ever fully describe, a moment that felt bigger than life itself. For years, she had lived quietly, thinking the world had forgotten her. But now she realized something powerful. The world hadn't forgotten. She had just forgotten how much she still had to give. The host came running toward her, grinning from ear to ear. "Mrs. Thompson," he said breathlessly, "I've been doing this show for 12 years. I've never seen a reaction like that. You didn't just sing, you moved people." Margaret laughed softly, brushing a tear from her cheek. "Oh, I didn't move them," she said kindly. "The music did. I just let it speak." Meanwhile, the audience was still buzzing with excitement. People who had come for fun and light-hearted performances were now deeply touched. Even the judges, who were used to hearing singers every year, couldn't stop talking about her. She sang from her soul. One of them said, "That's the kind of performance people remember for the rest of their lives." The young men who had once signed her up as a prank were silent, their faces red with regret. One of them, named Jake, felt a lump form in his throat. He couldn't take his eyes off the stage. He remembered laughing about the idea just a week ago, Grandma Maggie singing, "That'll be funny." Now he felt ashamed. He turned to his friends and said quietly, "We should apologize to her." When the show ended, the crowd surrounded Margaret. People wanted to shake her hand, take pictures, and tell her how much her song meant to them. Some said they hadn't cried like that in years. Others said she reminded them of their own mothers or grandmothers, strong women who carried untold dreams in their hearts. Jake and his friends slowly made their way through the crowd until they finally reached her. Margaret turned and saw them standing awkwardly, heads bowed. "Mrs. Thompson," Jake began softly, We owe you an apology. We put your name on the list as a joke. We thought it'd be funny. But we were wrong. You were amazing. You've taught us something tonight." Margaret smiled, not with anger, not with pride, but with pure kindness. She placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. "That's quite all right, dear," she said warmly. Sometimes life has a funny way of turning jokes into miracles. Her words hit him harder than any lecture could. For the rest of his life, he would never forget that night or the lesson she had taught him about respect, courage, and the power of second chances. Later, as Margaret left the hall, people followed her outside just to see her off. The night sky was clear, and stars glittered above, almost as if they were clapping too. The air was cool, carrying the sound of laughter and joy from inside the building. Someone shouted from the doorway, "We love you, Mrs. Thompson." She turned and waved, her heart glowing. "Thank you," she said, her voice soft but strong. "You've given me more than you'll ever know." When she reached home that night, the applause was still echoing in her ears. She placed her handbag on the table and looked around her quiet living room. Everything was the same, the old clock ticking, her books neatly stacked. The picture of William smiling from the mantel, but somehow, it all felt different. Brighter, she walked to the window and looked out at the moonlit garden. The flowers swayed gently in the breeze, and for a moment, she imagined her late husband standing there, smiling at her the way he used to. "I did it, Will," she whispered softly. "I finally sang again." A tear rolled down her cheek, but this time it wasn't a tear of sadness. It was joy, deep, fulfilling, and peaceful. The next morning, she woke up to find dozens of messages and letters on her doorstep. People had left flowers, cards, and handwritten notes thanking her for her performance. Some said she had inspired them to chase their own dreams. Others said they had shown the video to their families, and everyone cried together. Margaret sat on her porch, reading each message slowly. Every word touched her heart. For the first time in years, she didn't feel invisible. She felt seen, loved, and celebrated. That evening, as the sun began to set, she sat at her piano, an old one she hadn't touched in decades. Her fingers brushed the keys gently, and she smiled. Then, softly, she began to sing again. Not for an audience, not for applause, just for herself. And somewhere in that quiet moment, as her voice floated through the room, she realized something beautiful that night at the talent show wasn't just her comeback. It was her rebirth. Margaret Thompson had become a symbol of hope, a reminder that no matter your age, your time can come again. And sometimes the biggest standing ovation isn't from the crowd, it's from life itself. Applauding you for never giving up. The sun rose softly over Willow Creek the next morning, painting the town in shades of gold and pink. Birds sang in the trees, and the streets slowly came alive with chatter. But something was different that day. There was a new kind of excitement in the air. People everywhere were talking about the same thing: Margaret Thompson. Her performance from the talent show had been recorded by a few people in the audience, and by dawn, those videos had spread like wildfire online. One clip in particular, the moment she hit that soaring final note, was being shared thousands of times every hour. The caption read, "When they laughed at her, she sang and silenced them all." Across social media, people were leaving comments from every corner of the world. "This gave me chills." "I'm crying." "She's incredible." "She reminded me of my grandma, so full of love and strength." Age is just a number. Dreams never die. Within a week, the video had millions of views. News channels picked up the story. Headlines appeared everywhere. Elderly woman wins hearts worldwide with soulful song. From joke to inspiration, the voice that moved a generation. Margaret's quiet little life suddenly became a symbol of something much greater: hope, courage, and the power of never giving up. Reporters came to her doorstep asking for interviews. TV hosts wanted to invite her to sing on national programs. But she remained humble, always answering with her soft smile and gentle grace. "I didn't mean to become famous," she said once during an interview, sitting in her cozy living room surrounded by flowers and cards from fans. "I just wanted to sing again, that's all." Her words touched even more hearts. People weren't just inspired by her voice. They were inspired by her spirit. One afternoon, the same group of young men who had once signed her up as a joke came to visit her house. They brought her a bouquet of fresh roses and a handwritten card. Inside, it said, "You changed the way we see people and the way we see ourselves. Thank you for forgiving us and for teaching us what true courage looks like." Margaret read the note, smiled, and said softly, "Sometimes the smallest mistake can lead to the greatest blessing." The boys never forgot that day. They began volunteering at the community center, helping organize future talent shows, but this time with kindness in their hearts. Months passed, and Margaret's fame didn't fade. In fact, it grew stronger. She was invited to sing at charity events, schools, and even a senior festival in the city. Everywhere she went, people wanted to meet her, hug her, and tell her how her story had changed them. At one event, a young woman approached her with tears in her eyes. "Mrs. Thompson," she said, "I was about to give up on my dream of becoming a singer. People kept telling me I was too old, too late, too ordinary. But then I saw your video. You gave me hope again." Margaret held her hand gently. "It's never too late, my dear," she said. "Dreams don't have an expiration date. They only fade if you stop believing in them." Her words became quoted on posters, articles, and motivational videos all over the internet. People began calling her the voice of second chances. Back in Willow Creek, the town's community center decided to rename the annual event. A new sign was hung above the stage: the Margaret Thompson Talent Show, celebrating every dream. When they invited her to attend the next year as an honorary guest, she stood on that same stage again, not as a contestant, but as a living legend. The hall was filled with laughter, music, and bright faces, just like before. But this time, there was something different in the air: respect, inspiration, and love. As the show began, the host invited Margaret to say a few words. She took the microphone, smiled at the crowd, and said, "Last year, I stood here trembling, unsure of myself. I thought my song was forgotten. But that night, you reminded me that dreams never truly leave us. They wait patiently for us to remember them. If you have a dream, no matter how old you are, don't let it fade. The world still needs your song." The audience rose to their feet once again, giving her another standing ovation. Some were crying, others smiling, but every single person in that room felt the same thing: hope. That night, as Margaret walked home under the quiet stars, she felt at peace. Her story had come full circle. What started as a cruel joke had turned into something beautiful. A story that would live on long after her voice faded. She sat by her window, looking out at the moonlight glimmering on the flowers in her garden. She could almost feel William beside her, proud and smiling. "Funny, isn't it?" she whispered softly. "I thought I'd stopped living for dreams. But the dream never stopped living in me." A soft breeze rustled through the window, and she closed her eyes with a peaceful smile. And somewhere out there, in countless homes and hearts around the world, people watched her video again, some for the first time, some for the 100th, and felt something deep stir inside them. Margaret Thompson had become more than just a woman with a beautiful voice. She had become a reminder that courage can bloom at any age, that it's never too late to stand tall, and that sometimes the most extraordinary stories begin with a moment no one ever expected, and every time someone felt afraid to chase a forgotten dream, they would remember her, the elderly woman who was told to sing as a joke, but ended up singing her way into the world's heart.